everyone. This is Jamarl Thomas. I am your host of the Progressive Soapbox. I hope everything is going okay today, and I hope all of you have had an amazing day. Let's do the news. Now, specifically, I want to go into a conversation that Tulsi Gabbard was having during the town hall conversation, interview, discussion, whatever you want to call it. But during the CNN town hall, one of the most peculiar and odd attacks on Tulsi Gabbard, and in some cases, even the framing of some of the questions, had to do with this thing of being an anti-interventionist. For whatever reason, this seems to be mind-blowing to people, that you can be in the military, that you can be commander-in-chief, while simultaneously not being an interventionist. I find it to be an odd question, but that's the question that they're going to answer. How can you continue to be in the military while simultaneously saying you're an anti-interventionist? It took me a while to figure out why this was a bizarre phenomena, or why this was so difficult for the people to understand the connection between these two things being together. I mean, and I'll explain it further into it. But Tulsi Gabbard gets the opportunity she's asked this question, and she goes into why she's an anti-interventionist and how she can be both. I want to add a little bit on to this. I'm going to show her video, but I want to add a little bit on before showing her video. Despite the framing of the question makes it as if it's a foregone conclusion that these two things are connected to one another, meaning anti-interventionist policies while simultaneously being commander-in-chief or being part of the military. Here's the thing. Just because something gives you the just cause, or that you consider just cause for some kind of intervention or humanitarian bombs, it doesn't mean it's a just war. Like, having a just cause and a just war are two separate things. Just because you think something has happened that demands action, let me say it this way. Justice in and of itself is not an absolute. Meaning justice doesn't exist in this kind of absolute way. There's no God looking down on it saying this is right, this is wrong, per se. These are things we make in our own human conceptions. But regardless of what we want to think of justice, we still live by cause and effect. Now, what I mean by the cause and effect thing is, just because you think you have a just cause for a war doesn't necessarily mean your interventions is going to be for the betterment of the whole. I mean, keep in mind, think about what we're talking about here. Think about our interactions around the globe and ask yourself, have those been to the best of the American public? I understand that weapons contractors, made out like gangbusters, but I'm talking about the American public itself, the people who had to fight those wars, the people who had to pay for those wars. Was it worth it? Just because you have a just cause doesn't necessarily mean it gives you just cause for a just war, or it doesn't necessarily mean you have a just war. So the first thing is, what is the meaning of intervention? Anti-interventionist. So is it possible to have a foreign policy where you have objectives that you're trying to accomplish while not bombing, attacking, or killing a lot of people in order to accomplish those objectives? For example, police action would be an example of an anti-interventionist activity. You're not using your military in order to destroy a country. You're using police action. Maybe working in coordination with other governments in order to put pressure on the government. Hey, maybe even out-of-the-box thinking, like instead of bombs, providing resources to those countries used in a particular context to allow those countries to get out of some kind of quagmire that they're in. Also, we must understand that the wars that the United States has taken has been wars of choice. Our interventions in other people's countries have been interventions of choice, not necessity. I think the problem here that they're having with this idea of military service and anti-interventionists is, you may join the military because you want to have a positive effect in defending your country. You may be raised in this idea that military service is a proud tradition to be involved in. Now, the reality of it is, and the honesty of it is, that many people join military because they want to get out of the straits to which their society has allowed them to be intertwined in. But there are a lot of people that still join the military, and even the people who join because of pay, I would imagine, get a sense of pride in being a part of the military service. They don't join this military, though, with the idea that the president or Congress would allow them to be put into harm's way for shits and giggles. Meaning they're not joining the military in order to overthrow Syria, in order to overthrow Venezuela, in order to attack Iraq when it doesn't have weapons of mass destruction. It's not engaging into these affairs, into these military conquests for something that they want to do. They join it for a different reason. That's the essence of military service. It's a secondary thing to go and say interventions. This idea of interventions for choice. I think the problem here is that for so long, these things have been so intertwined and intertwined. Something happens, the United States must respond. The response of the United States is almost built into whatever takes place. It's automatic. What is the president going to do about it? I'm saying that an anti-interventionist policy while being a soldier is, yes, we're going to defend this country if anything takes place. We are going to sign up. I'm going to grab my weapon and we're going to go out there and be a man on the wall. That's a difference, however, than we are going to use economic sanctions in order to get rid of or topple the government of Venezuela. We're going to use economic sanctions, or for that matter, military, or the CIA to topple the government of Syria, or destroy Libya, or down the line, Yemen, etc., etc., etc. There's a difference in those things. Those things are not intrinsically linked in the way that this is often discussed. The media's perspective on foreign policy is that whatever the United States is doing, by definition, the United States is right. So if the United States is working to overthrow the government of Venezuela, it doesn't look at this from a critical perspective. It doesn't look at this from a historical perspective that the United States has supported dictators all around the world, particularly in Latin America. It doesn't look at it from that perspective. By definition, what the United States is doing is right, and because it's right, this idea of the United States involving itself in regime change, off the table. If the United States is doing that, it's doing it for humanitarian reasons. This is kind of what I'm getting at, why I think they have this trouble disassociating this idea of an anti-interventionist policy versus being associated with the military. Being associated with the military is protecting your country and your fellow men. Being an interventionist is being willing to essentially ignore international law, ignore international norms, and go through disingenuous, insincere processes of shaping the world in the way that you believe the world should be shaped. There is a magnificent difference in those things, and it's a little disturbing that the media can't see the difference in those things. There's a difference in taking a war out of necessity, meaning you don't have a choice. You're forced into this situation, as opposed to political posturing or political expedience or just rank political repugnance. Let's take a listen to Tulsi answer this question. I'm starting it in the middle because Tulsi answers this or attacks this from the perspective of, I've come to this conclusion because of the way I've been a soldier. And I've seen how soldiers, meaning us, people like us, get put on the lines for wars that were entirely unnecessary. That needs to stop. Not just that needs to stop, we're getting to the point of being in another nuclear contest or another Cold War. That needs to stop. Being anti-interventionist is just basically not starting wars that you don't necessarily need to start, and ending those wars that have gone on for far too long. I don't understand why the anti-interventionist thing is something that's bewildering to people, but for whatever reason it is. So she has to explain this. I think that's it. Yeah. All right, let's listen to Tulsi give her explanation of this. No. Yes. I think.
The price.
Yes. Good.
And my brothers and sisters who never made that trip home, who paid that ultimate price. And those who did, coming home with wounds, both visible and invisible, that they would continue to struggle with for years after. My position and my commitment in fighting to end these counterproductive regime change wars is based on these experiences and my understanding the cost of war and who pays the price. Yes, it is our service members. It is our troops. It is our military families. It is the people in these countries where these wars are waged whose suffering ends up far worse after we launch these regime change wars. But it is also every single one of us here. Every single American is paying for these wars through our taxpayer dollars, trillions of our taxpayer dollars being spent, dollars that should be used to invest in and to meet the needs and serve the needs of people here at home, to pay for things like healthcare and education, to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. So as a soldier, I stand ready to serve and protect and defend this country. And as a soldier, I know the cost of war. And as president and commander-in-chief, I will end these regime change wars. I will work to end this new Cold War and this nuclear arms race that is costing us trillions. And again, take those resources, those limited resources, and use them to serve the needs of people here.
Which wars would you end when you're talking? I mean, that's a lot that you just laid out there.
It is a lot, but this is the threat that we're facing. Regime change wars that we are seeing still being carried out in Syria. Regime change wars that this current administration is threatening to carry out in countries like Venezuela, laying down the groundwork to carry out a regime change war in Iran. We see throughout decades how this policy has persisted through both Democrat and Republican administrations and the negative impact that these wars have caused.
Congressman,
making a point of a bipartisan consensus on war. Not just bipartisan consensus, even media consensus. Understand that they didn't... It would seem natural as natural can be to take the perspective that the United States is engaged in backing up one dictator after the next. There we are. Has been engaged in backing up one dictator after the next. I mean, this idea that Maduro is a dictator, in and of itself, how many dictators do you know have that much opposition? I mean, it seems like dictators would not necessarily be on board for this. But they make these arguments. And regardless of them making these arguments, you know for yourself, in one situation after the next for Latin America, one country, Brazil, Honduras, Paraguay, El Salvador, Dominican Republic, Chile, all of these countries have been the victim of the United States regime change. Like, look at the back. These. It's going to restart. But essentially images showing the countries that had regime change, in addition to the number of casualties that was associated with that regime change, the havoc that was caused in those countries, the chaos that was caused in those countries, as we plunged those countries into absolute horrors, all for geopolitical influence, but also because we wanted to get our hands on those resources. The media should know this. I suspect the media does know this. The media doesn't take that tack, however, of, well, the United States has done this in the past, maybe that's what they're doing now. It is bizarre that they don't take that tack. And you can only come to the conclusion that either they are completely incompetent or they're in on it. I mean, look at this. The places I'm showing in the back, Iraq, Libya, Iran, all of these countries were essentially destroyed by the United States or bombed to hell by the United States. You're talking about death tolls in the hundreds of thousands. Even in Syria, where we were working with CIA assets in order to create a civil war in that country and to keep that war propagating, bubbling on. We're doing bad things. And those bad things are having gross negative consequences, especially on the troops that have to fight those wars. There is a disassociation between the political class that push for that stuff, but are not adversely affected by it anyway. There's no feedback mechanism on the politician that makes the decision to go to war. So when Bush decides to go into a conflict that is completely and fundamentally propped up, there's no consequence. After you find out that Iraq has no weapons of mass destruction, there's no consequence when Obama destroys Libya. I'm making a point that there's no consequences for the behaviors that are taken. There's no feedback mechanism, meaning it makes it difficult for to stop these things since there's nothing to prevent a political person from going through with it. Tulsi's point is, this needs to stop. Not only is it getting worse, meaning the level of hair on fire potential for nuclear winter is at the highest that it's been since any point that I'm aware of that I've been alive, particularly since the Cold War. Her point is we need to end this. We need to stop this. She's like, what wars do you want to end? I mean, the fact that you have to ask that question of itself is somewhat problematic. How many wars do you have that you need to ask that question of how many wars do you want to end, or what war do you want to end? Tulsi's right. Tulsi's right. Let's see how much more is this.
When you mentioned Syria, we actually have a question on that. I want to bring in Jessica James, a consultant from New Jersey.
Hi, thank you.
Now, this will be a separate video. Ideally, this would be a separate video. How much time? 50 minutes. Oh, all right. I'll add it here. So a question is asked about the chemical weapons, meaning, do you believe that Bashar al-Assad released chemical weapons? Her answer in this, and this goes beyond the scope of this particular conversation, but her answer in this is awesome. Because her thing is, look, I was part of the generation that went over to fight a war, and our government told us that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It behooves us to not just take what the government is telling you as a flat fact, just because the government is telling you, especially when you have a historical reference, to realize that they lied to get us into a larger conflict, and we've been in the Middle East for 18 years since, and I'm talking about recent. That's not even going back to this thing of Iran or of Afghanistan in order to get Russians to come into Afghanistan by putting resources in Afghanistan and tricking them in. Like, we have been instigating into the affair of the Middle East for God knows how long. Tulsi Gabbard's point is, this has not come to good ends. This has been to the detriment of the American public, and this has been to the detriment of the American image around the globe and our influence around the globe. Fact of the matter is, if you need to use military for all of these things, then something is wrong. What about this issue of soft power? What about this issue of working with allies? Can you use some level of influence that goes beyond this thing of some kind of military or putting people in straits where they're denying dialysis supplies and stuff like that? Like, I'm making a point that can you use influence without it being a blunt instrument and a blunt object? What is taking place in Venezuela is a blunt object. What they're lining up for in Iran is going to be essentially a replay of Iraq. Like, I'm trying to get across to you, and Tulsi is getting across to you, that if we allow this to continue to propagate itself, this is going to just get worse and worse. And a secondary point, anybody who's talking about a Green New Deal, anybody who's talking about Medicare for all, anybody who's talking about increasing the minimum wage, none of that stuff takes place if you're spending nearly $1 trillion on the military. Her other point in this is, if you want to get anything real accomplished from the domestic front, you got to deal with this out of control military budget. Tulsi is right. Let's see. I don't know if so if you can't see this, the stuff in the background that's taking place, I went through and added the death toll for some of the places that we've taken down. Iraq destroyed. There were 1 million supposedly dead in Iraq. Syria destroyed. There were around 400,000 dead in Syria. Our CIA worked in order to get rid of that government, not to mention work with white helmets and those forces on the ground. Yemen, Obama greenlit Yemen. Venezuela, we have no idea how many died in Venezuela yet. Under Bill Clinton, when they passed sanctions, those sanctions killed upwards of 500,000 children. So we have no idea how many deaths are going to be on our conscience based on the sanctions that were put. Not because they were necessary, not because the United States was under attack, but purely because we have a president that wanted to blow off all notion of international norms and get their hands on the resources of that country. I will end it here. Thanks all.